Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given. Well, hello, everyone. This is Karen W., and on today's show, we have Lundy Bancroft. He is an author, workshop leader, and consultant on domestic abuse and child maltreatment. One of his most famous books, and one of the first books given to me, is Why Does He Do That? His newest book, In Custody, is a novel and thriller. You will not want to put it down, I'm telling you. It tells the story of a mother and daughter that have gone missing and the news reporter that goes undercover to discover an underground system at work to protect the most desperate parent and children from the failings of the family court system. So we are so honored to have you on the podcast and so appreciate your work. And I loved reading about the inspiration for your book, that it was to expose readers to this very important issue in novel form, to make it entertaining and educational all in one. And you certainly accomplished that, as I couldn't put it down. And when I finished it, I felt like I'd watched a movie in my head. I just kept thinking about the story and really thinking about it. I couldn't get it out of my mind. But not only had I been entertained, but I truly was educated about the plight of so many and the need of this to be addressed and hopefully to have change. So if you want to start by just sharing any more about your background and your inspiration for this book.
So, as a lot of people know, I've worked in domestic violence for a long time. And in fact, I'm in the process now of retiring from most domestic violence work. And I had a mounting experience over my years in the field of being more and more concerned about what my clients, because I worked with the offenders primarily, not with the abused women.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
What my clients were like as parents, and how destructive men who abuse women are to children who live in the home. And so then I guess it was really in the late 90s when we started to realize that not only were our clients starting to really learn how to use the custody courts as a weapon, but that they were starting to win a remarkable amount of the time, that we started to get very, very concerned, because we thought, well, how's a woman ever able to get out of an abusive situation if she has children?
Yeah, right.
If the court's not allowing her to protect her children post-separation from the abuser. And so it became really apparent to me that if we want to make progress on freedom and rights for women and children so that they don't have to live with a terrifying tyrant in the home, we're going to have to do something about the child custody system, because the child custody system has become what seems to be the number one national enabler of domestic violence and child abuse.
Yeah, that's so crazy.
Wow. Well, I'm Brenda J. Nice to meet you.
Brenda?
In Custody is about a mom and daughter who runs because she's not getting protection from the family court system. In your opinion, why do the courts so often side with the abuser when there's evidence to the contrary?
Well, there's so many different reasons, but where I always think it's valuable to start first is the money trail. And people always say, follow the money. And there's a lot of truth to it in this case, because there is a phenomenal amount of money being made off of divorcing couples. It's money being made by attorneys. It's being made by custody evaluators. It's being made by psychological evaluators who are so often hired as part of a custody evaluation that the court has ordered. It's money being made by mediators. There's a relatively new category of professional called parenting coordinators, and I can explain more about what that is. A huge disaster of a new professional category. It's not doing anything to help abused women in any of the cases that I've been involved in, and generally making things much worse for them. So parenting coordinators, and then a whole category of professionals that are called reunification therapists. And I can explain more about what they're all about. And there's an inherent conflict of interest in custody court proceedings, in that all these professionals are being paid by the hour. And the less well they do their jobs, the more money they make. And what I mean by this, the more that they can contribute to feeding tension rather than resolving tension, the more money they will make. And that means, for example, that when there's an abuser in the picture, or someone that there's pretty strong reason to believe is an abuser, they're going to do much better financially if they deny the abuse than if they acknowledge the abuse. If they acknowledge the abuse, address the abuser properly, set proper limits on his behavior. And since I'm in domestic violence, the abuser is generally he. If they take proper steps to keep the children safe from future exposure to his behavior, things are going to settle down and they're going to make less money. On the other hand, if they blame the mom and say, no, she's exaggerating it, or no, we actually don't believe what she's saying at all about the domestic violence, if they don't investigate properly, just don't look into it very much and just reject the allegations out of hand and keep the abuser as involved as possible in the children's lives, then they're going to have years and years and years of terrible conflict as mom tries to protect her children and as the children deteriorate psychologically. So that's problem one, is that you make the money by siding with the abuser. You don't make the money by properly investigating the case. If it's true, which it usually is, siding with properly protecting children from exposure to this man.
There's a lot of ethics involved in that. Like, are you going to do the right thing or not?
Right. It's an ethical mess. And the divorce profession is justifying this behavior by actually training new people into a whole set of divorce theories that are without basis. They're a lot of rot, but on the surface of it, they sound very persuasive. And so when I first started to work as a custody evaluator myself, when I first started to be a guardian ad litem, which is a kind of custody evaluator, the organization that I was part of, my state association of guardians ad litem, and a national organization that I was part of called the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. Actually, I don't think I ever belonged to them, but I read all their literature and went to a couple of their conferences. They were kind of training me into a way of thinking about divorce. It didn't work because I already knew too much.
That before or after you wrote your book, like why does he do that you did that?
This was before even actually it was around the time that I was writing Why Does He Do That? Mm-hmm. That all this was happening. So in my novel, In Custody, the main character, this young journalist, Carrie Green, she goes through some similar steps to what I went through, where she's hearing early, and I'm not going to give too much away, but early in the book, she's hearing all this standard stuff from divorce experts that she interviews for her articles, all the same stuff that I heard when I was new. And so she's kind of getting sucked in to these really destructive, absurd theories that have been created about divorce. And the reason I'm emphasizing these theories is because they create a whole set of excuses for lawyers and custody evaluators and therapists who are working with the children and all these different professional roles that I listed off for you. Create a set of excuses for them to dismiss the reports of domestic violence or the report that he's also abusing the children, and so that they can get away with conducting themselves really irresponsibly. And then there are a couple other things I should underline for when you ask why this is happening. One is that quite apart from domestic violence, research tells us that for at least the first 2 years after a divorce, men are in substantially better position financially than women, on average. I'm not saying in every single case, but on average. For at least 2 years, men are in better position. In a domestic violence case, that disparity is going to be worse because abusers manipulate money, they lie about money, they hide money, they rip women off financially. So whatever disparity we're finding on average, that's going to be that much worse in a case where there's a history of abuse. So he's got a big advantage going into court because he's almost always got more money and access to more money. So that's a big factor. And then the sad additional reality that people are reluctant to talk about, but that I think is important to talk about, is that we continue to have an extremely gender-biased custody court system where the parenting of mothers is judged by a completely different standard than the parenting of fathers is judged by. And again, any of these things that you're interested in, I'm happy to come back to and say more about. Yeah. And you'll hear people say, oh, the courts used to be so favorable to mothers. Well, we actually don't have clear evidence that that's true. We do know that for a brief period of time in historical terms, maybe something like 50 or 60 years, in the beginning of the 1900s, mothers were tending to win most child custody. But that's not evidence of bias, because mothers were doing almost all the rearing of children during those years.
Yeah,
that's what people are forgetting when they say, oh, the courts were so biased in favor of mothers. Like, no. if mothers were winning 90% of custody during those years, and we don't know that they were, we don't have that kind of research, but if they were winning 90% of custodies during those years, that would actually be evidence of a pretty even-handed court, because they were certainly doing 90% of the raising of children, perhaps more. And so people now think, well, if you look at a court and you see, mothers winning custody 50% of the time and fathers winning custody 50% of the time, that's a really even-handed court. No, it isn't. That's evidence of horrible pro-father bias, because even in our times, mothers are doing the overwhelming majority of child rearing. It's gotten better. Fathers are carrying their weight certainly more than they were 30 years ago. So you think they're getting anywhere close to half? No way. In fact, there's research on that showing that it's really only a little up in how much fathers are doing in child rearing. And so people are reluctant to face that this is an extremely biased court system, not biased against fathers, biased against mothers. So there's these multiple causes. I could list off more, but I don't want to take all day just on this one question of why is it happening the way it's happening? I see increasing indications in recent years there's a certain level of outright corruption. But that's very hard to prove, and we haven't succeeded at all in getting the FBI to look into this question, because sometimes there's enough of a trail that I think the FBI, if they bothered, would be able to start to see some of the evidence of it. But that's corruption's a whole other issue. I don't choose to put the biggest emphasis on that because there's so many other reasons that are things that could be much more easily addressed.
Yeah. And I remember hearing you say in one of your interviews too, that I never thought about that, but in these cases, like there is no jury, like the judge has a lot of power in a lot of these cases, or in all the cases.
When you give one person that much power, you're asking for power to be abused. I mean, that's what happens when you give one person that much power in any context.
Yeah, that's a dynamic of abuse. Yeah.
I mean, not everybody does it, but if you give one person that much power, a lot of people are going to abuse it. And it's just too much of an invitation for who have leanings in that direction. And we have the additional problem in the custody court, in a domestic violence case, where if the judge is kind of into power himself or herself, well, then that judge's natural affinity is going to be for the accused abuser.
Right.
They're going to almost unconsciously be drawn to the person who's also into power. And they're going to think things like, yeah, I'm sick of people accusing me of doing things that I didn't do too. Except they're probably being accused of doing things that they did do. And I'm sick of people whining too. I mean, there's a lot of the kinds of things that the abuser is radiating. Power mongering judge is going to really like. And unfortunately, and I hate to say this, but unfortunately, the female judges are not treating mothers any better than the male judges are. And what some people say about that, and I don't know if this is true, but what some people say about that is that in order to rise to family court, to be a family court judge, you have to have sort of out-mailed the male.
Play by the rules.
Yeah, and maybe that's what the problem is. But I've just had so many cases where a mother went into court thinking, well, this judge might be a mother herself. Like she's going to understand, more about why I'm worried for my kid. And then she just can't believe how the judge treating her. And that turns up in custody in the novel also, where the viciousness of the judges can come from a woman as well as from a man.
Yeah, wow. There is a lot of corruption in that. So that's why I'm glad that you're calling attention to it, because it does need to be looked at. And that's where our hope is that there will be change. So we have a gal in our private online Facebook group that she's been battling her ex-husband in court for years. I mean, she had the same lawyer that I had. And so she's always, asking for prayer. And it's just exasperating to witness, because he sexually abused their kids. And yet he does seem to get a lot of favor. And it just boggles your mind. So I know this issue needs to be called attention to, because it costs a lot of money. She spent a lot of money to continue to fight in court. And I've heard you say that the courts are one of the biggest enablers to abusers, like you just said. Can you share a little background as to how the courts have evolved from the 80s to now to be more dangerous to the mothers in failing to protect the children?
Well, they've become even more kind of instantly inclined to reject disclosures of domestic violence or disclosures of child sexual abuse. And what happened is that in the early part of this century, and probably for a long way far back before that, but that's just, I only know the history back to about 1880. There just weren't a lot of disclosures of domestic violence or of child sexual abuse. It wasn't talked about. And people who were being horribly abused were just living with it because they assumed that there was nothing they could do. They felt completely powerless.
Right.
So through a bunch of social changes, including the women's movement of the 60s and 70s and some other important social changes, particularly in the 70s, women started to disclose at much higher rates if they were being abused, and children started to be more likely to tell somebody if they were being sexually abused. And children who did disclose to their moms were more likely to have their moms believe them than to have their moms say, no, that didn't happen, or blame the child, or, somehow make it the child's fault. You seduced dad, or the kind of, horrible things that have been said to girls over the centuries. And so the court in the 70s and the 80s started to hear a lot more reports of domestic violence and child sexual abuse, which was exactly what the society wanted. The society, and I'm not just talking about American society, but a lot of the society around the globe wanted these forms of abuse to stop and wanted these forms of abuse brought to light and wanted children to come forward. I mean, we had so much effort in the schools, for example, over recent decades to encourage children to come forward. And the family court, rather than taking the reaction of like, well, yeah, this is what the society has been pushing for, is for people to come forward. This is a good thing that they're coming forward. The family court's outlook has been, this is very suspicious. Why are there suddenly all these reports of domestic violence and child sexual abuse? Like mothers must be up to something. No basis for that, and just completely ignoring all the obvious historical reasons why this was happening.
Yeah.
All the good reasons why. And so they developed a lot of theories to allow them to, for very ridiculous, spurious reasons, not look at the evidence and ignore reports of domestic violence and ignore disclosures of child sexual abuse. And so I've been close to case after case, including cases where I've been over the evidence so carefully myself, where very entirely credible disclosures by children of child sexual abuse were dismissed by the court for reasons that would make anybody just scream who knew the first thing about child sexual abuse or who knew the first thing about domestic violence. And without taking you too much into the detail, but particular divorce theories, a guy named Richard Gardner, a woman named Janet Johnston, those two have probably really led the way. They devoted their careers to developing theories that made it possible for the court to dismiss abuse and not bother to investigate it properly. Judges are also very fond of saying, well, it's just his word against hers. And custody evaluators are very fond of saying it's just his word against hers. Well, I was a custody evaluator for a few years. I did some 30 or so custody evaluations. It's almost never his word against hers. If you go out and do proper investigation, you can almost always find out whether an allegation is true or false. And are there some false allegations? Of course, there are false allegations of every crime in the world. The notion that somehow they're rampant about domestic violence or rampant about child sexual abuse is false, and there's research showing that it's false. But you have to investigate properly because they could be false. But when it came time for me to write my report, I almost never had to rely on which parent I considered more believable. I would say out of 30 evaluations I did, there were maybe twice when I sort of had to make my recommendations based on which parent I found more believable. The whole rest of the time, I was able, just by properly doing my job, to find plenty of evidence that would make any reasonable person feel quite comfortable saying, yes, these allegations are true, or no, these allegations are not. And the court's not interested in investigating these things because, for all the reasons I've said, they don't really want to look seriously into what happened. They don't want to know.
Yeah,
so we
really matter.
We need to completely stop giving people space for this. Well, but we're helpless in the court because all we have is his word against hers. That's total rot.
Yeah.
Wow, this is maddening.
It makes me be more thankful that I felt like I made a mistake, that I stayed too long with them. But I had 3 kids and my oldest was 17, about to turn 18. I think I had a year. And now as I listen to this, I realize that years of not going through that nightmare also, that's, I mean, just listening to this, I'm still shocked. I'm in shock right now.
It's very tricky for moms because sometimes your kids can be very resentful towards you for having waited longer to leave.
Yeah.
But then you try to leave earlier, and then they come to resent you for the custody battle, even though it's not your fault.
Right.
And also the abuser starts to so manipulate them and try to turn them against you.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's not an easy, anyone who says, well, mom should just do this is wrong. Like if they say, well, you should have just left him earlier. It's like, well, no, that would have led to its own set of challenges. And maybe it would have gone better, and maybe it would have gone worse. So like that part of you that's thinking, God, maybe it's all for the best that I just hung in there till my child's almost to majority.
Right.
You may very well be right. I mean, Obviously, there's no way to know for sure except to somehow live two lives down two
Right.
different decision paths and see how they play
Right.
out. But it's quite possible that you're right. I mean, the nightmare of what happens when the custody court sides with the abuser is just, I just don't know anything worse that goes on in a mother's life.
Yeah, I would have been a nightmare for me. And I knew that. I thought through that every time. So one of the main characters from your book is involved in a father's rights movement, which I was not familiar with before. Can you share a little bit more about that movement?
So the father's rights movement goes back a long way. It goes back to the late 1980s, maybe farther back than that, but I know of it back to the late 1980s. I was aware of it by the early 90s. And the short version of that is that in the late 70s and into the 80s, the US and I suspect other countries as well started to get much tougher about collecting child support. And at the time, that seemed like a good thing. I was in favor of it at the time. I think everybody was in favor of it at the time. It seemed so positive, but it wasn't. What we didn't realize was that we were awakening a sleeping giant, because abusers before used to just kind of disappear for the most part at breakup. And that was terrible that they weren't supporting their children. But we didn't realize that the alternative was worse. And which was for them to be involved with their children's lives and dead set on destroying those kids' relationships with their mothers. And so as child support enforcement got tough, the abusers started to organize. And their main complaint was child support. And you see that in their early literature. I started to read their stuff long, long ago when I became aware of them. And they were really, that was their main thing that they were enraged about, was child support. So you can tell that that's where the movement has its roots. But then their literature started more and more to have this focus on false allegations of domestic violence and false allegations of child sexual abuse. And that's when it became clear to me, oh, this movement is now focused on recruiting batterers and incest perpetrators. That's who they're reaching out to. I mean, because that's a code word. Like false allegations is a code word when you're trying to recruit perpetrators. And
oh my, wow.
And again, it's a long story for how I know that that's what they were doing, but I'd have to tell a lot about what's in their literature. But once you spend a bunch of time in their literature, you realize they're not concerned about false allegations. They're concerned about true allegations. That's what's upsetting them.
Oh, yeah, it is very upsetting.
And so, and of course, they're not going to call it the abusers' rights movement. That's not going to get them any kind of public traction.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it was very clever to call themselves Father's Rights. And in fact, they succeeded. One thing that's so revolting about what happened is that they succeeded in getting themselves positioned as the national voice of the interests of divorcing fathers. Like they represent supposedly the needs and interests of divorcing fathers. So I've had several times over the years talking to journalists and trying to get them to cover this scandal. And they'll say, well, now I need to talk to some of the father's rights guys. And I'll say, talk to the fathers. Why do you have to talk to them before you can write this article? And they would say, well, because, we're talking to mothers and now we have to get the father's opinion. I'd say, go to the father's rights guys for the father's opinion. That's like doing an article, about racism and saying, well, I need to get some white people's opinion on this. So I'm going to call the Ku Klux Klan. No, you're going to get some white people's outlook on your racism article. You don't go to the Ku Klux Klan.
Right.
Yeah, but that's where, this is the parallels. Oh, we're going to talk to the batterers' rights movement, or what I typically call the father supremacy movement, because that's what the father's rights organizations really are. They're father supremacy organizations. We're going to talk to the father supremacists. That's, and they're going to be the voice of fatherhood. Another thing that to me is really significant and unfortunate is that they actually did a really good job of organizing. And I hate to give them that credit, but the abusers organized really well. They organized very grassroots, very local. Their focus was on local organizing and getting lots of people involved. And county by county, court by court. And their focus was very heavily on picketing the courts. They were out there picketing. Although they do periodically push state by state for these 50-50 custody presumptions that legislators will fall for very easily, because on the surface of it, you think, 50-50 custody, that sounds fair. As long as you don't care about kids, as long as you only care about the parents, it sounds fair. So this has been very, very difficult for mothers to match. It's very hard for mothers to organize court by court, county by county in large numbers, because they're raising their children.
Right.
And because they don't have a lot of money.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, I just got a message right before this podcast from a woman that is struggling with the exact same thing. She's in the middle of a court battle. The lawyer, she's got this huge lawyer bill. She's running out of money. They want some kind of payment. I mean, exactly what we're talking about right now. It's just such a strange coincidence. I'm just kind of baffled right now listening to all this. So go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
And there have been a lot of efforts to go through state legislatures and to some extent federal legislation, but mostly state legislatures to try to get laws passed that will improve the position of a mother who's been abused with respect to child custody.
And she's asking me about getting full custody, and I was, yeah, that's the question. That's why when you're talking, it's all, wow. Okay, go ahead.
So there are better laws now in probably 2/3 of the states in the United States, and it has had zero impact on what the court's actually doing. So I hate to say it, but people need to let go of the notion that the solution of this is through law. That's not the solution, because the family court is very free to just ignore the law. There's a whole complicated set of reasons why they're so free to do that. So our protests have to focus on protesting the court, not on trying to pressure not on trying to protest the legislature. And there's a new organization called Mothers on the Rise that I encourage people to look into, mothersontherise.org, that its mission is to help women do this kind of county by county, court by court organizing that I really believe, because I've seen so many good ideas over the past 30 years to try to fight for mom's custody rights, or particularly in the last 20 years, great events that have been put on, great marches that have been put on, great pieces of legislation that have been proposed and even passed, and it has not changed the picture. So we've got to I believe that the only way it's going to change is when we get the numbers up. We have to have 50 times as many activists as we have now. And most of those activists are going to end up being mothers themselves. I mean, we need to get more allies involved also, both male and female allies who aren't in the protective mother position. But it's going to take a really broad-based movement with far, far greater numbers. And I think we can do it if we really put our focus on thinking in that direction.
Yeah, and that's good that you have that resource in your book. So yeah, I'm definitely going to look. I did pull up on their website. So that's the thing. It's so frustrating to hear about how complex it is, and there's just no easy answers, but we got to do something. So even, getting involved in this organization would be something that we could do where you don't feel like you're just powerless over it.
Yes.
So another thing that stood out to me about your book is how greatly this affects not just the mother and the child, but the friends and family when there is a situation so dire that the mom and child or children need to run. And they are put in a position of wanting to help, but being pressured by the police to give any information they may have. So they're pulled in these two different directions, which I could see would just be so tormenting. And the character in your book, Sophia, she has her life turned completely upside down from just being torn in that, being in that position. So I was curious, from your research, is this pretty common, you think?
To be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 2 of In Custody with Lundy Bancroft. You don't want to miss it.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.